Hello, I'm Mary Anna Mancuso, and welcome back to Book Corner Friends. I'm so glad that you're here, and I'm really excited about today's conversation. Joining us is Bill Wong, co founder of the Ronin Project PAC and host of the Ronin Project podcast. And Bill is also an award winning political consultant and author to Better to Win Hardball Lessons in Leadership, Influence, and Craft of Politics. Bill, thank you so much for joining me.
Hi, Mariana. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. I'm so excited. So, I really enjoyed reading your book. It was really great to learn a lot more about your story, your career, as well as all of the headway that you've made with elected officials, as well as behind the scenes for the AAPI community. Now, one question that I definitely have is that your book is part memoir and part Sun Tzu Art of War for Politics of sorts. How was the political arena? How has it changed since when you first got started?
I think it's a lot more complicated, and I think that in some ways it's come a little bit off the rails. So we have a lot of political strategies that aren't implied applied in context with regard to our values or our principles. It's kind of the Hunger Games now, I feel like, which is a little bit soul crushing.
No, I would have to agree. And I can't believe I have seen it changed over just the past 15 years. And I can't imagine what you've seen having served much longer in the political arena. Now, in your book, you talk about your experience on the high school football team. Would you mind talking a little bit about that and how it prepared you for a career in politics, or maybe it didn't?
I think it did. I think it prepares you more for life. I think team sports is really important because it teaches you how to interact with other people. It teaches you that everybody has kind of a lane and a role and how exists in context. I think with regard to civic life, we all should look at civic life like a team sport, and we all can't win every game. And sometimes we have to take a hit for somebody else. So I think that the football experience really taught me about those types of values. It was a fun sport, but it really taught me about sacrifice. It taught me about leadership. It taught me about caring about the person that's next to you and taking on roles that may be unpleasant, but you need to do. And then also taking responsibility for your actions and your mistakes, which is one of the stories that I write about in the book.
Yeah, and you talk about having to do things that you might not necessarily want to do. And the one thing that I really learned about you from your book was that you're not one to shy away from doing those things, especially the things that need to get done, even if they're not the most glamorous. You talk about building 25 IKEA desks, which you must be a total whiz with an Allen wrench now. And you also talk about precinct walking until the final minutes on election day. Do you think your willingness to jump in and do whatever it takes on a campaign aided you in your success in the industry?
Definitely for my background. I didn't my father was a cook, my mom was a waitress. I didn't, come from wealth. I was actually an immigrant to this country. So I think that that type of diligence and determination and attention to detail is what really helped me succeed in a very competitive and in a lot of ways an arena that is stacked against people like me.
Absolutely. Can you talk a little bit more about that? I think that's really it was a very compelling part of your story, and I think it was also extremely important for our viewers to understand that, and I would love for you to share a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I came here when I was 6 months old. My parents had abandoned everything to escape communist China. And my grandfather had come here in the 30s, and he had a very small restaurant in a very rural town. So there was not a lot of diversity going on. So definitely were a lot of challenges. And what my parents taught me a bit was about perseverance and patience and knowing that you might not have exactly what you want when you get here, but if you work hard enough, you can get that. I think that's a little bit different from the society we live in, where everybody wants immediate gratification. And in a lot of ways, what they did too was that everything was substantive, and now we have a lot of things that are more superficial. So people are in debt and just to maintain an image. They have houses that they can't afford, cars that they can't afford, lifestyles that they can't afford, because so much of it is driven by this kind of external perception where they just struggle to put food on the table and a roof over their heads. And we were very happy to have that. And we didn't really feel compelled to have to drive fancy cars or to, have that we actually didn't have the luxury of supporting that type of image.
Do you think that in today's American society, it's become very decadent, which has actually caused a problem within our political system?
I do. I'm not, it might be decadence, but also might be complacency. The irony that we have in California is that for the first time in a decade, we're facing a budget deficit. And many of the legislators and staffers that are here have never served during a time where we had to make very big cuts to the disabled or to the needy or to the indigent, any of those types of hard decisions, or even to like education. So we're able to exist in a leadership frame where things are easy or decisions are easy. And I think one of the things about my upbringing as well as my time in football was it really taught you how to persevere in very unpleasant situations, or situations that are very tough and tested your character.
No, I would have to agree with you. And, in your book, you share a story about your time as the chief of staff to now Congresswoman Judy Chu. And you talked about how you gave up coveted office space next to her office for Scott Bain. He was the Appropriations Committee health policy expert to allow her access to him for budget and policy questions. The move was no doubt on your part a very political calculation, which I applaud you because going back to your original point, we don't need to drive fancy cars for people to know who we are and what we do. Now, do you think that access to Chu actually the access that she had to Scott Bain when she was chairwoman of the Assembly Appropriations Committee was a game changer when it came time for her to fight against the proposed reductions of the Medi-Cal optional benefits?
Oh, absolutely. Scott is a brilliant staffer, but he also needed a lot of quiet in order to perform at his best. And where he originally was situated was probably the noisiest part of the office. So I put him in the quietest part of the office where I knew that he would perform well, and where the assembly member could have direct access to him, because she would have more questions for him than she would have for me because of the budget process at the time. So I think that was, for me, everything is based upon what is the best strategy, not is what is the best perception.
Now, interestingly enough, as I was reading your book and I'm going through kind of the experiences that you're sharing, your time serving and the things that you did on the various races that you held through Ronan Pack and Aspire, as well as others, the one thing that kept coming back to me in my notes as I was preparing for our chat today was Shadow Warriors, the name of the Japanese television show you watched growing up. I have to admit, I definitely watched 2 episodes before we sat down today, and I was actually really compelled and understand why you enjoyed that show so much. Um, so it was about these main characters, and they worked together to thwart these scenes of people trying to take over the government by corrupt and power-hungry politicians. They lived by this code, and they worked both in and out of the government to help people. Looking back on your career, I've got to be honest with you, Bill. I think it's pretty safe to say that you were a shadow warrior of California politics. Would you agree with that?
That definitely was the aspiration, to be able to do those things. And what really I thought was fascinating about the show and life in this world, as you know, is there are a lot of difficult decisions, and they're murky, and they're not the best case scenario. In fact, you're just trying to make the least worst decision you can make. And I really love that idea, because sometimes when we watch media, we have this narrative about life in America, is that there's always the perfect solution. And I feel that that's unrealistic. And I feel like we some people spend so much time to create the perception of a perfect solution that they never actually fix any of the problems. And ultimately, the characters in the show had to make compromises between themselves in order to, follow their code and achieve their objectives. Both objectives being very noble, but not necessarily always aligned.
Right. No, and also thinking outside of the box, which is something that you did pretty successfully, I might add, in the 2010 gubernatorial race between Meg Whitman and Jerry Brown. You deviated from past polling techniques, which I thought was ingenious, and you opted to poll what you titled iconic validators. Can you share a little bit about what an iconic validator is and how that idea came to you?
Well, we had been in a lot of campaigns where the standard operating procedure is to find the most local elected official or most pronounced elected official as influencers to how voters vote. And that may have been appropriate in the past, but voters in California, because it's so large, and probably other places, are so detached from the process, they really don't know who their elected officials are. And particularly in the Asian American community, which is very new to politics, there were no Asian American elected officials that had a lot of pull for their endorsements, which, you can have if it's a John F. Kennedy or, somebody like a Martin Luther King or something like that. But there's no such person existed. Yet we continue to poll the elected officials that were Asian American and always got the same result, which like nobody knew who they were. The ones that did know, the 5% that did know who they were, yes, they were compelling, but that was not really an efficient use of our um, time and effort, because polling now is extraordinarily expensive. So questions on a poll are you have to be very efficient with them. So instead, I looked at kind of for most of, regardless of what the actual specific sub-ethnic group is, a lot of Asian American behavior is based upon hierarchical values and iconic types of authority figures. So we decided to poll, instead of known elected officials, we decided to poll titles like teacher, police officer, church leader, business leader, and those were off the charts. I mean, they moved people by 15, 17%. So
Wow.
then I had to go find Noah's Ark of all the Chinese, Vietnamese, and Korean versions of a teacher, a doctor, a business leader, a police officer, and have them ready to be able to appear on ads or in mailers.
Would you say that political consultants going forward should lean into using iconic validators when messaging to the Asian American community?
I think so, because we don't really have even celebrities. They don't move the needle. And I've done enough polls where it's just a waste of your question. And you can only have a certain number of questions in a poll before you have drop off from the respondents. So if you're going to be efficient, it's more easy to poll iconic validators than it is. And also because we're not a monolith. A Chinese elected official may not resonate with a Vietnamese American voter, so, but you can always find like a Vietnamese American teacher or a Vietnamese American doctor or business leader and fill them in, because they don't really have to know that person personally, but they know the title and they know that it has a Vietnamese name. So then they feel more connected to that person as a validator on their voting decision.
And that makes sense. People are able to identify with those individuals, even if they don't know them, they can see themselves in that person in that role. So I think that makes a lot of sense. And I thought that was a very unique idea when it came to polling. Now, one thing that I think is really fascinating is the story that you talk about meeting John Podesta, and he's talking about Hillary 2016, and he's telling everyone they need to get on the bandwagon. It's Hillary, she's going to be the president. And he's showing you his strategy slides, and he actually doesn't ever at any point talk about targeting and having conversations with the Asian American community. And if you could just kind of set the stage for us a little bit into that, what happens that day in that meeting, because I thought that was a really compelling story. And I think that more people need to understand that when they're looking to run campaigns, national, state, local, whatever, it's important to engage on every part of the electorate, not just the ones you think are going to move the needle. Because the fact is, you had plenty of examples of races that moved the needle where people didn't think that the electorate would have the ability to within the AAPI community.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. It actually was planes, trains, and automobiles getting to San Francisco. I only live in Sacramento, which is typically an hour and a half there, but it took that day. It took me 3 hours to get into the city to attend this meeting, and I was just curious. And he goes through the slides and he talks about the overall vote advantage, the women's vote advantage, then the Black vote advantage, the Latino vote advantage, and then his slideshow stops. And I'm looking around. There's probably like 10 other Asians there, and this is a kind of a donor presentation because I donated to the Ready for Hillary campaign. So I'm thinking, if there's 10 people here that are Asian, somebody should have put in an Asian slide, even if they made it up, because none of us would check, and they didn't even bother to do that. And this was also a culmination of probably years of watching public polls that are out there where they completely leave Asians off, and the feeling of erasure on it. And I get it, there's different languages, there's a lot of different types of things that are involved. But if you're in California, if you look nationwide, the population is growing. And if you have as much money as a Hillary Clinton campaign, you obviously can poll Asians, or at least spend the money to fake that you polled Asians. And for them to not even try just pissed me off beyond my my mind, and I just got up and left because I was just so offended by the arrogance of the presentation.
Now, do you think if they had actually worked on engaging with Asian Americans in 2016, if there had been a slide, that there would have been a different outcome with Hillary versus Trump in 2016? And I know I'm asking you to like look back into your magic 8 ball, but humor me.
Um, I, I I think that it was symptomatic of what was wrong with the campaign is that
Mhm,
they um, chose what they wanted to ignore or who was not relevant. And you could see that not just on which voters they reached out to, but which consultants they brought in to consult the campaign, how they which states they focused on. It was basically we've got this, and the people that don't matter was the general feeling that I got from both that event and how the campaign was run. And considering that
mhm.
this campaign was lost by such a small margin, yeah, I think that if they had like figured out a little bit better ways to find those pockets of voters that they could move, they would have won the election.
Absolutely. Now, do you think that Democrats have learned from this mistake?
No. I mean, maybe in small
I
pockets, but no. I mean, and you've been in the business long enough that winning campaigns is not necessarily what keeps you in business as a consultant. It's
right.
relationships, it's,
Yeah.
uh, friends that have gone way back. And there's always easy ways to explain why you lost a campaign. And they're all not bad people, but, they got to pay their bills, they got to get their clients. And the Asian American community has not leaned in enough to be able to say, if you don't start paying attention to our community, there will be political consequences to it.
Now, springing off that, you did tell a story about an evening when everybody was gathered at dinner, and this gentleman stands up and he's like, do you remember when this legislator was talking bad about the AAPI community? And everyone kind of lambasted him, and everyone at the table was like, oh, I remember that. And he said, this never happened. Now, do you think that is there a possibility that we can make that moment happen where the community comes together and says, you need to pay attention to us as an electorate because we have the ability to move the needle on elections and change the outcome of the future of the country?
There's always the opportunity. The question is whether or not they're willing to take it. I think that um, it's. I truly believe it's not hardwired into Asian American culture to be passive and to be deferential. At
Hmm.
one point in time, Genghis Khan had conquered, most of the modern, world civilization. One of the most feared pirates in world history was a Chinese woman who led a fleet of 400 ships and terrorized, the colonial empires that were out there. So
Hmm.
I think there is DNA there. The question is whether or not the Asian American community decides to act upon it.
Fair enough. That makes sense. So looking ahead to 2024, I know it feels too early, but it doesn't feel like we don't have a lot of runway either. It's a really weird space that we're currently living in, especially after CNN's town hall earlier this week. What advice would you give to campaigns on both sides of the aisle when it comes to engaging with the AAPI community?
I think it has to be bespoke because the API community in different states is different. Like the API community in Nevada is different than the API community in Washington and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. So you really have to have people on the ground, and you really have to have people that have an ear for that community. I was talking to a consultant the other day, and they went through several iterations just in Oregon's Vietnamese community because the tone of the different voiceovers had a huge implication. Some of it sounded too young, some of it sounded too old, some of the word choice was a little bit too communist. Um, so it was very nuanced. And if you're going to win a congressional district by a couple of thousand votes, that is going to be the difference, is to pay attention to those small details as opposed to just checking the box saying we did mail and telling your client that you did everything you could. I think that everything has to be really designed in a very bespoke manner.
And this also includes translations. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Translations are like they are the crux of where the biggest challenges are because one, in any translation of any language, idioms don't necessarily translate. So you could say, take a horse to water but can't make a drink. That makes no sense in Chinese. We don't have an equivalent idiom for it. So when
Right.
you write mail or write a TV ad in English and then you ask somebody to translate it, a lot of times the professional services will translate it literally, and then it will make no sense whatsoever. Um, in fact, one of the consultants I was telling about, they had something translated where the opponent had changed positions on an issue a lot of times, and that was used as a negative. But then the translation came back as the opponent enjoyed different sexual positions. So if you don't have somebody who understands what is being sent
Right.
back to you, then you may end up sending it out in mail that's inappropriate. That's why we have to add several filters. And in the case of Oregon, they had local filters where they're like, if I'm writing mail from California and it's being sent to Texas, the Texans will know. Similarly, if I'm writing, mail from California that from a Vietnamese perspective, it may sound different than the Vietnamese that ended up in Oregon or ended up in a different state. So you have to really be localized, have a local team on the ground that can like listen to it and see if it really makes sense or if it's executed properly. And in for the governor's race, we actually did have a couple situations where the graphic designer cut and pasted the wrong section or repeated the section. So if you don't have somebody double checking that type of stuff, you will one miss the voter, and then two, you also waste a lot of money on mail or ads.
Yeah, and there was the translation issue, I think if I remember correctly, regarding Meg Whitman talking about her voting record, where it was something about she had voted in 24 years versus she had not voted in 24 years. So it's
Exactly.
really important. And I think that it is important to drive home those nuances and those points because when you wanting to engage with the entire portion of the electorate, you want to make sure that you're talking to them in a way that they are going to participate and be engaged instead of being spoken at. And I think that what I have seen, and you would know better than I, is I see that there's a lot of coalition building, but the coalition building that we're seeing happen is actually just people being talked at and not engaged and brought in.
Absolutely, and I think that that's the other problem is when we do it, because we've done polling, and it really shows that a lot of the communities, not just Asians, but also Latinos and African Americans, feel like we only communicate with them 2 or 3 weeks out from election, and that really just pisses them off. What we should be doing is communicating with them 365 days a year, even though it may be low volume, at least some type of contact outside of the context of a impending election is going to really help both parties convince them that we care about their vote.
Yeah, and it seems more as though they're the last, like, "Oh, well, we just forgot about you, but it's almost election day, so please come out and vote for my candidate, join the campaign." And it's like, "Well, where were you for the past year and a half when your candidate was running?" And so I agree, it always seems like an afterthought. I think the same thing happens too as the coalition of women begins to grow, right? Like, the candidates are halfway through the race, and they're like, "We need a group of women." And they're starting to do it with other ethnic swaths, and I think it's a massive disservice, and it's poor form. Let's just call this what it is. It's poor form. And the consultants who are leading these races really, let's take a breath and think about how we can do this and really engage the electorate instead of just talk at them right before the election ends.
That's a great point. One of the races I was in that's not an Asian race, but we had a female candidate. The consultants were a bunch of guys. They're great guys, but when they wrote the mail, it didn't sound like her, and she was pushing back, saying that doesn't sound like me. But the establishment was these guys know what they're doing, so we had to really step in and say, no, you need to address her concerns because it's about her authenticity. But sometimes we're in such a rush to get the mail out, we cut corners and we become less sensitive to those types of nuances.
Absolutely. And it's been interesting to see how those things take place. And one of the things that made me think of this while you were talking about, these consultants trying to write a piece from a female perspective, which I mean, that just continues to happen on all sorts of scales across the country in general, is the situation where you had, party apparatus coming to your candidates who were Asian American trying to run and telling them that no, you're not going to win, so we're not going to support you. Is that something that and pardon my ignorance on this, is this something that you're still seeing in these upcoming races, or do you think that there's been kind of a slow turn of the tide where now the DNC apparatus, other party apparatus are actually looking to invest more into other candidates besides just the average white man?
It's been a progression. It's been a progression from completely oblivious to somewhat aware but ignoring to now checking the box and maybe at the precipice of actually doing something legitimately substantive to reach out to the Asian American community. But a lot of that is also driven by the fact that the Congressional Asia Pacific Islander Caucus has grown and they have more influence on the
Mhm.
workings of the DCCC. I imagine as there are more Republican Asians that are elected, that they're going to have some influence on the Republican political establishment too. And that's why it's so important to have them there to, advocate because it's not necessarily insidious. It's just kind of an ignorance or just a blind spot that they have if that voice isn't in the room. Same with, I think, women is if you don't have women in the room, you're going to get a very male oriented perspective.
Absolutely. No, I would agree. Now, throughout your book, you share a lot of war stories about campaigns you were involved in. And you also talk about, different super PACs that you've done stuff with. What is one story that you really wanted to include, but it didn't make the final cut of the book?
Um, I don't know. I mean, I had written a lot of stuff and I put it all in order to maintain my momentum of finishing this project. I just wrote a lot of stuff and I try to find things that fit in there. There are stuff that are not Asian related. For example, when I worked for Anthony Rendon, who was an assembly member, he eventually became Speaker of the Assembly. But when he came in as a freshman, he decided to take on the effort to craft a water bond, a $9 billion water bond for California. And obviously, water is very important. And the reason why was because the previous water bond, which was $14 billion, had been done as a Christmas tree initiative of serving various interests. So the two things that we did differently in this was one, he came out on the front end saying that there would be no earmarks, and that stunned the establishment because that was the only way water bonds had previously been passed was by people making commitments based upon what earmark they got into the water bond. But the voters are really cynical and we're tired of the people that had money being able to direct where water was going to go and where water projects were going to go. So he came out and said, we are going to build a water bond based upon principles like the use of technology, where the water was needed most, how to conserve water, different things that were just principle based as opposed to specific project based. And we actually went to a editorial board in the San Francisco Chronicle and got laughed out of the editorial board saying that it would never pass with the strategy that we had taken by announcing early on that there would not be any earmarks. But we have actually used the tactic as you know, as a consultant, peer pressure is very powerful persuader.
Mhm.
So when he first started out with that, everybody was shy about asking for earmark because they didn't want to be the first person to ask for earmark. And at the end, nobody asked for an earmark because of that very reason, and we were able to pass it without any earmarks, and it passed with 60% of the popular vote in California.
That's really wow, that's impressive. Kudos to you. Now, one thing I do want to ask you about is you talked about you were working with a client and you went to a committee meeting and people spotted you at the meeting and they started getting nervous. Does this still happen to you where you show up to these meetings and they're like, "Oh my gosh, Bill Wong is there. What is going on?"
It seems self-serving to say if I said yes, and it could just be my own ego talking. But when this did happen, it probably was the best compliment that I could ever been paid in my 30 years of service. And I do know that, um, yeah, it's harder for me to operate now than I used to be able to operate.
So now you're out in the sunshine, you're not in the shadows anymore as a shadow warrior. So
That
I
was
have
the whole
one
point
last
of the retirement.
I don't blame you. I hear it's nice. So one last question for you. What is the one thing that you hope people take away from your book when they're done reading it?
It sounds really Pollyannish. My hope is that they take away some optimism because what really was disturbing in recent history is that I think that people feel like solving the legitimate problems we have in society today is just getting on Twitter and yelling out into the ether. And I think that if you have dedicated operators on both sides of the aisle, I mean, that's why I respect you, I respect Madrid, all of these people that are there doing the day to day work to get things done. But it requires skill, it requires compromise, it requires an understanding about how people work, and it's not performative. And I think that too much of how we approach politics on both sides of the aisle now is very performative. Even if you don't really believe in what you're saying, you feel compelled to engage politics from that screaming standpoint. And I think that committed individuals who are very well skilled can actually help solve the problems that we face universally in this nation.
Well, I will tell you that it is not Pollyannish. Actually, when I finished reading your book, I did feel a sense of hope. I felt a sense of hope in being able to find common ground, work across the aisle, and as well as understand that there is a craft to politics still, even though it does feel very performative most days. But it was nice to be able to read your book. And then one of the first things you say out of the gate is like, this is not the workbook on how to climb the ladder, how to do politics. This is merely lessons in leadership. And I really liked that. And you talked a lot about in your career how you led a lot of people. And I will say that I do agree that when I finished your book, I did feel very hopeful about the future. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
So thank you so much, Bill. I just want to say that I appreciate you taking time to sit down with me and talk about your book. It was fantastic, and I encourage anyone and everyone to get out and buy a copy. And to everybody who tuned in, thank you. If you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to share it with your friends and family. And in the meantime, to see what's on my reading list, follow me on Twitter at Mary Anna Mancuso. And if you have any book recommendations, send them my way. Have a fantastic week, and we'll chat soon.